Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
A company needs to regularly transfer large volumes of data between NFS file systems located in two different AWS regions. Which solution would you recommend to minimize operational overhead?
I would recommend using AWS Data Sync for this task.
What AWS solution would you choose for a fully managed shared storage that supports SMB clients for a gaming app?
I would select Amazon FSx for Windows File Server. Create the file system, attach it to the origin server, and then connect the application server to it.
A company needs a cost-effective network design for a latency-sensitive in-memory database application running on EC2, processing over 100,000 transactions per minute. What would you recommend?
I would launch all EC2 instances within the same availability zone in one AWS region and use a placement group with a cluster strategy to ensure high network throughput and minimal latency.
A company is migrating to AWS and wants to minimize scaling its on-premises aws-saa storage, keeping only recently accessed data locally. Which AWS solution would you recommend?
I would suggest using Amazon S3 File Gateway to meet this requirement.
A company uses consolidated billing with multiple AWS accounts and runs several high-performance Oracle RDS instances. How should the finance team use AWS Trusted Advisor to optimize RDS costs?
They should access Trusted Advisor recommendations directly from the AWS account, where the RDS instances are running, and specifically review the Amazon RDS Reserved Instance Optimization check.
How would you identify rarely accessed or unused Amazon S3 buckets to optimize storage costs efficiently?
I would enable AWS CloudTrail for S3 object monitoring and analyze bucket access patterns using CloudTrail logs integrated with Amazon CloudWatch logs.
A company sells large data sets stored in an Amazon S3 bucket to customers in North America and Europe. They want to reduce data transfer costs and maintain or improve performance. What approach would you recommend?
I recommend deploying an Amazon CloudFront distribution with the existing S3 bucket as the origin, directing customer requests to the CloudFront URL, and switching to CloudFront signed URLs for access control.
A company needs a web application on AWS to process insurance quotes. The quotes must be separated by type, responded to within 24 hours, and must not get lost. How would you design a solution that maximizes efficiency and minimizes maintenance?
I would create multiple Amazon Kinesis data firehose delivery streams based on each quote type, delivering data to an Amazon OpenSearch service cluster. The application would send messages to the appropriate delivery stream, and backend servers would search OpenSearch to process messages accordingly.
A company runs an application on multiple EC2 instances, each with several EBS volumes attached. They need nightly backups of both configuration and data, with recovery possible in another AWS region. What's the most efficient way to achieve this?
The most efficient solution would be to use AWS Backup to create a backup plan that performs nightly backups of the application's EBS volumes and then copies these backups to another AWS region.
A company is developing a mobile app on AWS to reach millions of users, allowing authorized viewing of content. What AWS solution would you suggest?
I would recommend using Amazon CloudFront and providing signed URLs to securely stream the content to authorized users.
A company needs to migrate an infrequently accessed MySQL database to AWS with minimal downtime and without choosing a specific instance type. What AWS service would you recommend?
I would recommend using Amazon Aurora Serverless for MySQL, as it automatically scales and doesn't require selecting a specific instance type.
A company is migrating applications to Amazon EC2 after experiencing an on-premises breach due to vulnerabilities. How would you recommend they actively scan EC2 instances for vulnerabilities and report findings?
I would enable Amazon Guard Duty, deploy Guard Duty agents on the EC2 instances, and configure an AWS Lambda function to automatically generate and distribute reports detailing any findings.
A company is using an EC2 instance to pull and process messages from an Amazon SQS queue. They want to reduce operational costs, but still handle an increasing number of messages. What would you recommend?
I would recommend increasing the size of the EC2 instance to process messages faster.
A company has CSV data from a legacy app stored in Amazon S3, but their new application can only analyze data in Amazon Redshift or S3, and it can't process CSV files. What's the best way to handle this with minimal operational overhead?
The best solution is to set up an AWS Glue ETL job that processes the CSV files regularly and stores the transformed data directly in Amazon Redshift.
After migrating to AWS, the company noticed users provisioning oversized EC2 instances and modifying security rules without proper controls. How would you address tracking and auditing these changes?
I would enable AWS CloudTrail to audit and monitor user activities, and also enable AWS Config, creating specific rules to audit and ensure compliance.
A company has many EC2 Linux instances and must remove shared SSH keys due to security concerns. What's the best solution with minimal administrative overhead?
The optimal solution is to use AWS Security Token Service, or AWS STS, to generate one-time SSH keys on demand.
A company is using EC2 instances to ingest JSON data from on-premises sources, but they lose data if an instance reboots. They need near real-time querying with minimal data loss. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend publishing the data to Amazon Kinesis data streams and then using Kinesis Data Analytics to query it in near real time.
How can a solutions architect ensure that all objects uploaded to an Amazon S3 bucket are encrypted?
The architect should update the bucket policy to deny any upload requests that don't include the XAMZDO server-side encryption header.
How would you design an application to quickly notify users when their image uploads are received while processing thumbnail generation asynchronously?
I would use Amazon Simple Queue service, placing a message on the queue when images are uploaded. This allows the application to immediately inform users their images have been received, while the thumbnail creation occurs asynchronously.
A company needs a highly available system to process HTTPS messages from badge readers at building entrances and make results accessible for security analysis. What architecture would you recommend?
I recommend creating an HTTPS endpoint using Amazon API Gateway, which would invoke an AWS Lambda function to process these messages and then store the results in an Amazon DynamoDB table.
A company needs a disaster recovery solution for a large on-premises file storage volume accessed via ISCSI. They want immediate file access without latency and minimal infrastructure changes. How would you approach this?
I would provision an AWS Storage Gateway Volume Gateway using a cached volume with a local cache of 10 terabytes. I'd mount this cached volume to the existing file server using ISCSI, copy all files to it, and set up scheduled snapshots. For recovery, I'd restore a snapshot to an Amazon EBS volume and attach it to an EC2 instance.
A company is hosting a web application from an Amazon S3 bucket, using Amazon Cognito for user authentication. Users report errors accessing protected content stored in another S3 bucket. How would you resolve this issue?
I would update the Amazon Cognito identity pool to assume the appropriate IAM role, ensuring users have the necessary permissions to access the protected content.
How would you recommend optimizing Amazon S3 storage costs for assets that are frequently accessed initially, but less predictably accessed later?
I would move the assets to S3 intelligent tiering after 30 days and configure an S3 lifecycle policy to clean up incomplete multi-part uploads.
How would you secure a VPC network hosting EC2 instances with highly sensitive data, ensuring that they can only access approved third-party software repositories for updates?
I would update the route table for the private subnet to route outbound traffic through an AWS network firewall and configure domain list rule groups to allow access only to the approved repositories.
A company expects a sudden increase in sales requests for their AWS-hosted e-commerce application. How would you ensure all requests are successfully processed?
I would recommend adding an Amazon CloudFront distribution for static content and using an Amazon Simple Queue service queue to collect requests from the website for asynchronous processing by the EC2 instances.
A security audit shows EC2 instances aren't being regularly patched. How would you ensure regular security scans, patching, and reporting for these instances?
I would enable Amazon Inspector to regularly scan the EC2 instances for software vulnerabilities and set up AWS Systems Manager Patch Manager to automatically patch the instances on a schedule and generate reports on their patch status.
How can a solutions architect ensure data stored on Amazon RDS-DB instances is encrypted at rest?
They should generate a certificate in AWS Certificate Manager and enable SSL Chuck TLS on the DB instances using that certificate.
A company needs to move 20 terabytes of data to AWS within 30 days, but their network is limited to 15 megabits per second and can't exceed 70% usage. How would you handle this migration?
I would recommend using AWS Snowball to physically transfer the data, as this solution bypasses the network limitations and ensures the data migration is completed within the required time frame.
A company wants to securely provide remote employees access to confidential files stored on an on-premises Windows server, which is running out of capacity. What solution would you recommend?
I would suggest migrating the files to Amazon FSx for Windows File Server, integrating it with the existing on-premises Active Directory, and configuring AWS Client VPN for secure access.
A company's application running on EC2 instances behind an application load balancer experiences performance issues at midnight on the first day of each month due to a batch job causing high CPU usage. What solution would you recommend to handle this workload effectively and avoid downtime?
I would recommend configuring an EC2 auto-scaling scheduled scaling policy based on the monthly schedule. This ensures that additional resources are automatically available to handle the increased workload when the batch job runs.
A company needs customers to use their existing on-premises Microsoft Active Directory to download files stored in Amazon S3 using an SFTP client. What's the simplest solution that doesn't require changing the customer's application?
They should set up AWS Database Migration Service to synchronize the on-premises client with Amazon S3 and configure integrated Active Directory authentication.
A company faces sudden demand spikes and needs to quickly provision large EC2 instances with minimal latency. These instances will run in an auto-scaling group. What approach would you recommend?
I would recommend enabling AMI creation and defining lifecycle rules using Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager. Additionally, creating an AWS Lambda function to automatically update the AMI used by the auto-scaling group would ensure minimal initialization latency.
A company needs to encrypt and rotate database credentials every 14 days for an application using Amazon Aurora, MySQL, and EC2 instances. What's the simplest way to achieve this?
The simplest approach would be to use AWS Key Management Service to create an encryption key and AWS Secrets Manager to store the credentials. Then set Secrets Manager to automatically rotate the credentials every 14 days.
A company using Amazon RDS for MySQL with multiple red replicas is experiencing replication lag during peak load. How would you solve this issue while minimizing changes to the application and operational overhead?
I would migrate the database to Amazon Aurora MySQL, replace the current read replicas with Aurora replicas, and configure Aurora auto-scaling.
How would you set up a cost-effective disaster recovery plan for a high-volume SaaS platform that uses Amazon Aurora MySQL, ensuring data replication to a secondary AWS region?
I'd set up an Aurora Global Database for the cluster, ensuring at least one DB instance is running in the secondary region.
A company has an application with embedded credentials, accessing an Amazon RDS MySQL database. They want to enhance security with minimal programming effort. What would you recommend?
I recommend creating credentials for the RDS MySQL database user and storing them in AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. Then configure the application to load these credentials from Parameter Store and set up a credential rotation schedule using Parameter Store.
A media company's cybersecurity team found their AWS-hosted website vulnerable to SQL injection. How should they address this?
They should subscribe to AWS Shield Advanced, which automatically blocks all SQL injection attempts.
A company has an Amazon S3 data lake managed by AWS Lake Formation and wants to visualize data in QuickSight by joining it with operational data from an Amazon Aurora MySQL database. They also need column-level authorization for their marketing team. What's the most efficient solution?
Use AWS Glue Elastic Views to create a materialized view of the database in Amazon S3, enforce column-level access control through an S3 bucket policy, and then use Amazon S3 as the data source in QuickSight.
The company has weekly batch jobs running on EC2 instances with high CPU utilization. They want to automate scaling 30 minutes before these jobs start. What's the best way to achieve this with minimal operational overhead?
I would recommend creating a predictive scaling policy for the auto-scaling group. This policy would forecast CPU utilization and automatically scale instances, pre-launching them 30 minutes before the batch jobs begin.
Can you describe a disaster recovery solution for a MySQL database on AWS that involves multiple regions and minimal operational overhead?
I would migrate the MySQL database to Amazon RDS, set up a multi-AZ deployment, and enable read replication for the primary database instance across different availability zones.
A Java application currently using Amazon SQS can't handle messages larger than 256 kbars. What's the simplest way to enable it to handle messages up to 50 MB?
The simplest solution is to use the Amazon SQS Extended Client Library for Java to store messages larger than 256 KB in Amazon S3.
A company needs a cost-effective serverless solution to restrict access to its web application, authenticate fewer than 100 users, and deliver content globally with minimal latency. Which approach would you recommend?
I would recommend using Amazon Cognito for authentication, Lambda Edge for authorization, and Amazon CloudFront to serve the web application globally.
A company wants to migrate data from an aging NAS array to Amazon S3 and maintain the same user experience for client workstations. Which AWS storage gateway type would you recommend?
I would recommend using Amazon FSx File Gateway to meet these requirements.
A company has an application running on EC2 instances and wants to maximize cost savings over the next 3 years, but also needs flexibility to change instance family and sizes within 6 months. Which option would be most cost-effective?
Standard reserved instances would be the most cost-effective solution in this scenario.
A company collects wearable device data in Amazon DynamoDB with a predictable workload. How can they manage DynamoDB costs effectively?
They should use provisioned mode with DynamoDB standard infrequent access and reserve capacity based on their forecasted workload.
A company needs to securely share an encrypted Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL database backup with another AWS account. How would you approach this?
I would create a database snapshot, update the AWS Key Management Service key policy to include the acquiring company's AWS account, and then share the snapshot with their AWS account.
A company has a 100 gigabit Amazon RDS SQL Server database and needs high availability, automatic recovery, and improved performance for periodic reporting. What steps would you recommend?
I would modify the database instance from single AZ to multi-AZ deployment for high availability and automatic recovery. Additionally, I'd create a read replica in a different availability zone and direct all reporting requests to this replica to improve reporting performance.
A company is migrating its data management application to AWS and wants an event-driven, serverless architecture with minimal operational overhead. How would you approach this?
I would use AWS step functions to build the workflow, creating a state machine that invokes AWS Lambda functions for processing each workflow step.
A company is designing a network for an online multiplayer game using UDP protocol, deployed across 8 AWS regions. How can they minimize latency and packet loss for a better gaming experience?
They should set up AWS Global Accelerator with UDP listeners and endpoint groups in each region.
A company has a 3-tier web app hosted on EC2 instances within one availability zone, with a self-managed MySQL database on an EC2 instance using a 1 terabyte IO2 EBS volume. They expect peak traffic of around 1,000 IOPS for reads and writes, and want a cost-effective, fully managed, highly available solution that can handle double that capacity. What would you recommend?
I'd recommend moving to a multi-AZ deployment of Amazon RDS for MySQL using a general-purpose SSD, GP2, EBS volume. This approach provides high availability, fault tolerance, and cost savings while still meeting the required IOPS capacity.
A company hosting a serverless application on AWS is experiencing database connection timeouts during peak traffic. How would you address this issue with minimal changes to the code?
I would enable RDS proxy on the Amazon RDS database instance to manage database connections efficiently and reduce timeouts.
A company wants to migrate a CPU-intensive batch job to AWS. The job currently runs every hour and takes about 15 minutes on a server with 64 vCPUs and 512 GB memory. Which AWS solution would you recommend to run this job within the same time frame with minimal operational overhead?
I would recommend using AWS Lambda with functional scaling.
A company has data stored in Amazon S3 standard, but 75% of it is rarely accessed after 30 days. They still need immediate access and high availability, but want to reduce costs. What storage solution would you recommend?
I would suggest moving the data objects to Amazon S3 standard infrequent access after 30 days. This option maintains immediate accessibility, high availability, and resiliency while lowering storage costs.
A gaming company wants to move its public scoreboard application to AWS using EC2 Windows Server instances behind an application load balancer. The application has static files and dynamic server-side code. How would you design a highly available storage solution for this scenario?
I would store the static files on Amazon S3 and use Amazon CloudFront to cache the content at the edge. For the dynamic server-side code, I would use Amazon FSx for Windows File Server and mount it on each EC2 instance to share the files.
A social media company wants to dynamically resize images stored in Amazon S3 and serve them in the appropriate formats to clients. What's the most efficient way to achieve this with minimal operational overhead?
They should create a CloudFront response headers policy. This policy will automatically resize images and serve them in the correct format based on the user's browser information.
A hospital needs to securely store patient records in Amazon S3, ensuring encryption both in transit and at rest, with their compliance team managing the encryption keys. How would you approach this?
I would use the AWS Secure Transport condition on S3 bucket policies to enforce encrypted HTTPS connections. Then, I'd configure default encryption for each bucket using AWS Key Management Service keys, assigning key management responsibilities to the compliance team.
A company noticed their buy stock API calls the check funds API over the internet, instead of within the VPC. What's the simplest way to ensure these APIs communicate through the VPC?
They should add an X API key header in the HTTP header for authorization.
A company needs to host a multiplayer gaming application on AWS, requiring sub-millisecond latency for data reads and occasional historical queries with minimal operational overhead. What solution would you suggest?
I would recommend storing the data directly in an Amazon S3 bucket and setting up an S3 lifecycle policy to move older data to S3 Glacier Deep Archive for long-term storage. Then use Amazon Athena to perform one-time queries on the historical data.
A company needs to ensure that payment messages for a specific payment ID are processed in the order they're sent. How can a solutions architect achieve this?
They should write the messages to an Amazon Kinesis data stream using the payment ID as the partition key, and also write the messages to an Amazon Simple Queue service queue, setting the message attribute to use the payment ID.
A company needs to send unique game events concurrently to separate leaderboard, matchmaking, and authentication services, ensuring the events stay in order. Which AWS solution would you choose?
I would use Amazon's Simple Notification Service FIFO topics, as they guarantee event ordering and support concurrent processing.
A hospital is building an application to collect patient symptoms using Amazon SQS and SNS. How would you ensure the data is encrypted and accessible only to authorized personnel?
I would enable encryption on the SNS components, restrict key usage to authorized personnel through the default key policy, and set the topic policy to allow only encrypted connections over TLS. For SQS, I'd enable server-side encryption using an AWS KMS customer-managed key, apply a key policy restricting access to authorized users, and set the queue policy to accept only encrypted connections over TLS.
A company experienced accidental data loss when a database administrator edited a table. They need the ability to restore the database to a state from 5 minutes before any change within the last 30 days. Which AWS feature would you recommend?
I would recommend using automated backups on Amazon RDS, as this feature allows restoring the database to any point in time within the specified retention period.
A company's web application uses Amazon API Gateway, AWS Lambda, DynamoDB, and Cognito for user authentication. How would you ensure only subscribed users access premium content with minimal operational overhead?
I would apply fine-grained IAM permissions to the premium content in the DynamoDB table to restrict access only to users with subscriptions.
A company is using Route 53 latency-based routing for a UDP-based application hosted on premises globally. How would you enhance the application's performance and availability while maintaining compliance?
I would set up 3 network load balancers in AWS regions pointing to the on-premises endpoints. Then, I'd create an AWS Global Accelerator and register these load balancers as endpoints. Finally, I'd provide application access using a CNAME pointing to the accelerator's DNS.
How can a solutions architect enforce password complexity and rotation requirements for new IAM users?
They should set an overall password policy for the entire AWS account.
A company has several scheduled tasks running on a single EC2 instance, each written in different programming languages. They're concerned about performance and scalability. How would you address this issue with minimal operational overhead?
I would use AWS Batch to run these tasks as individual jobs and schedule them using Amazon Event Bridge.
A company has a 3-tier web application running on EC2 instances in private subnets that need internet access to reach a licensed server. What's a managed solution that minimizes operational maintenance?
Provision a NAT gateway in a public subnet, and then set the default route in each private subnet's route table to point to this NAT gateway.
A company wants to encrypt data at rest for an Amazon EKS cluster using EBS volumes and a customer-managed key. What's the best way to achieve this with minimal operational overhead?
First, use a Kubernetes plugin that utilizes the customer-managed key for data encryption. Then, store the customer-managed key as a Kubernetes secret within the EKS cluster and use it to encrypt the EBS volumes.
A company needs to migrate an Oracle database containing millions of high-resolution GS images to AWS, with frequent updates during disasters. What's the most cost-effective solution that's also highly available and scalable?
The best approach is to store the images in Amazon S3 buckets and use Amazon DynamoDB with geographic codes as keys and the S3 image URLs as values.
A company collects automobile sensor data streamed into Amazon S3, generating trillions of objects each year. They retrain machine learning models using the last 30 days of data daily and perform quarterly analysis using the previous year's data. The data must be quickly accessible for 1 year and then archived. What's the most cost-effective storage solution in AWS for this scenario?
The best approach would be to use the S3 standard storage class initially, then set up a lifecycle policy to move objects to S3 standard infrequent access after 30 days, and finally transition them to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 1 year.
A company has multiple applications running in separate VPCs that need to communicate with each other and send large amounts of data daily to an on-premises data center. What's the most cost-effective network solution?
I would recommend setting up one AWS Direct Connect connection from the data center to AWS, then creating a transit gateway and attaching each VPC to it. This approach efficiently connects the VPCs and the data center.
You're designing an architecture for an order processing application involving several AWS Lambda functions, manual approvals, and orchestration of data and services across EC2, containers, and on-premises servers. What's the best solution with the least operational overhead?
I would integrate all the application components within an AWS Glue job.
A company using Amazon RDS for MySQL experiences, random database connection errors from serverless applications during high demand. What's the simplest way to resolve this issue?
The simplest solution is to use Amazon RDS Proxy. I'd set up RDS Proxy and have the applications connect to the database through this proxy to handle connection pooling and avoid errors.
A company wants to ensure that all EC2 instances provisioned through autoscaling groups report to a centralized auditing system immediately upon launch and termination. What's the most efficient way to achieve this?
The most efficient approach is to use EC2 autoscaling lifecycle hooks. These hooks can trigger a custom script to send data to the auditing system whenever instances launch or terminate.
A company is developing a real-time multiplayer game using UDP communication, expecting spikes in demand. What solution would you recommend for traffic distribution and scalable non-relational data storage?
I would recommend using a network load balancer to handle UDP traffic distribution and Amazon DynamoDB on demand for scalable non-relational data storage.
A company has a front-end application using API Gateway and Lambda functions that connect to an Amazon RDS database. They want to reduce response latency with minimal operational changes. What approach would you recommend?
I would recommend caching the query results in Amazon S3. This would allow for faster retrieval of similar datasets and reduce latency.
A company is migrating workloads to AWS and needs to automatically start and stop EC2 and RDS instances outside business hours to minimize costs. What approach would you recommend?
I suggest scaling the EC2 instances using elastic resize and scaling the DB instances down to 0 outside of business hours.
A company hosts a 3-tier web application with a PostgreSQL database, storing document metadata, which they search monthly for reports. Documents are stored in Amazon S3 and frequently updated. Reporting currently takes hours and shouldn't impact document edits or additions. What's the simplest solution to speed up reporting with minimal changes to the application code?
The simplest solution is to set up a new Amazon DynamoDB table to store the documents, using a fixed write capacity for new entries and automatically scaling read capacity to handle the reporting workload.
How can a solutions architect enhance the security of data in transit for a 3-tier AWS application using a network load balancer?
They should configure a TLS listener and deploy the server certificate directly on the network load balancer.
A company wants to migrate a commercial application to AWS and continue using its existing socket and core-based licenses. Which Amazon EC2 pricing option would be most cost-effective?
Dedicated reserved hosts would be the most cost-effective option in this scenario.
A company has an application running on Amazon EC2 Linux instances across multiple availability zones. They need a highly available POSIX-compliant storage layer that's shareable and cost-effective, with frequent data access for the first 30 days and infrequent access afterward. What solution would you recommend?
I would suggest using the Amazon S3 standard storage class with an S3 lifecycle policy to transition infrequently accessed data to S3 standard infrequent access. This approach meets the availability, compliance, and cost-effectiveness requirements.
You're designing a VPC with public subnets for a load balancer, private subnets for web servers, and private subnets for MySQL. The load balancer security group allows HTTPS traffic from anywhere. How would you configure security groups to ensure least privilege access?
I would create a security group for the web servers, allowing HTTPS traffic only from the load balancer's security group. Then, I'd set up another security group for the MySQL servers, allowing port 3306 access only from the web server's security group.
An e-commerce company has performance issues due to frequent identical database calls. How would you address this issue?
I would implement Amazon Elasticache to cache the frequently requested datasets, which would improve backend performance by reducing repeated database queries.
A new deployment engineer will be using AWS Cloud Formation templates. How would you ensure they follow the principle of least privilege?
I would create a new IAM user for the deployment engineer and assign them to a group with permissions limited specifically to AWS Cloud Formation actions. Additionally, I'd create an IAM role explicitly defining permissions for the AWS Cloud Formation stack and have them launch stacks using this role.
A company has deployed a two-tier web application on AWS, but the web tier can't connect to the database. How would you resolve this?
I would add an inbound rule to the security group of the database tier's RDS instance, allowing traffic from the web tier security group.
A company has a large data set in an Amazon RDS MySQL instance and wants to run business reporting queries without affecting write operations. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend deploying the database instance in multiple availability zones to handle the business reporting queries separately from the production write operations.
A company runs a three-tier e-commerce application on EC2 instances with an application load balancer and Amazon RDS for MariaDB. They want to optimize durable customer session management. Which solutions would you recommend?
I would recommend using an Amazon DynamoDB table and deploying an Amazon Elasticache for Redis cluster to store customer session information durably.
Can you describe an appropriate backup strategy for a three-tier stateless web application running on EC2 instances and Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL, with a recovery point objective of 2 hours?
Yes, I'd recommend taking snapshots of the Amazon EBS volumes attached to the EC2 instances every 2 hours. Additionally, enabling automated backups in Amazon RDS with point-in-time recovery will ensure meeting the 2-hour recovery point objective.
How would you configure security groups for a public web application on AWS using EC2 web servers and an Amazon RDS MySQL database to ensure secure access for global customers with dynamic IP addresses?
I would set the web server's security group to allow inbound HTTPS traffic on port 443 from anywhere using 0.0.0000. For the database, I would configure the security group to permit inbound traffic on port 3306 only from the web server's security group.
A payment company stores customer call recordings in an Amazon S3 bucket and needs to extract text while removing personally identifiable information. How would you approach this?
I would set up an Amazon Transcribe transcription job with PII redaction enabled. Then I'd use an AWS Lambda function triggered by new audio file uploads to the S3 bucket to start the transcription job, storing the redacted transcripts in a separate S3 bucket.
A company's e-commerce app on AWS experiences performance issues when read and write operations exceed 20,000 IOPS. They're currently using a GP3 volume. How would you address this?
I would replace the existing GP3 volume with a provisioned IOPS SSD IO2 volume to handle higher IOPS and improve performance.
An IAM user recently made configuration changes to AWS resources, and now some security group rules aren't configured correctly. How would you determine which user made those changes?
I would use Amazon Inspector to identify the IAM user responsible for the changes.
A company has set up a self-managed DNS service on AWS using EC2 instances in multiple regions and AWS Global Accelerator endpoints. They want to protect this setup from DDoS attacks. What would you recommend?
I would recommend subscribing to AWS Shield Advanced and adding the Global Accelerator as the resource to protect.
An e-commerce company needs to run a daily job to aggregate and filter large sales records stored in Amazon S3. The job takes up to an hour and has predictable CPU and memory usage. What's the best AWS solution to minimize operational effort?
The best solution is to set up an Amazon ECS cluster with AWS Fargate. Then use Amazon EventBridge to schedule an ECS task daily to perform the aggregation and filtering.
A company needs to move 600 terabytes of sensitive data from their on-premises NAS system to AWS within 2 weeks. Their internet upload speed is 100 megabits per second. What's the most cost-effective way to do this securely?
They should set up a VPN connection between their on-premises NAS and the nearest AWS region, then transfer the data securely over the VPN.
How would you protect an AWS-hosted web application from HTTP flood attacks with minimal operational overhead?
I would create a regional AWS WAF Web ACL with a rate-based rule and associate this Web ACL with the API gateway stage.
A startup wants to alert internal teams whenever a new weather event is recorded in DynamoDB, but without affecting the application's performance. What's the most efficient way to achieve this?
They should enable Amazon DynamoDB streams on the table and use triggers to send notifications to a single Amazon SNS topic that all teams can subscribe to.
How would you make an existing on-premises application highly available and resilient using AWS, especially after experiencing data loss from a database server crash?
I would deploy the application servers on Amazon EC2 instances within an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones. For the database, I'd use Amazon RDS in a multi-AZ configuration to avoid single points of failure and ensure scalability.
A company's application sends large amounts of streaming data to Amazon Kinesis data streams, but not all data reaches Amazon S3. How can this be resolved?
You should update the default settings of Kinesis data streams by increasing the data retention period to ensure no data is lost before it's consumed and stored in Amazon S3.
A developer has an AWS Lambda function that uploads files to Amazon S3 and already has valid IAM credentials. How would you grant the necessary permissions for this task?
I would add the required IAM permissions directly into the resource policy of the Lambda function.
A company has a serverless application using AWS Lambda to process documents uploaded to an S3 bucket. After a marketing campaign, many documents weren't processed. How would you improve this architecture?
I would create an Amazon Simple Queue service queue, send document requests to this queue, and then configure the queue as an event source for the Lambda function. This setup helps manage processing loads more effectively.
Can you describe how you design an EC2-based software demo environment that handles increased weekday traffic but doesn't need to run on weekends?
I'd use a target tracking scaling policy to automatically scale the auto-scaling group based on instant CPU usage. Additionally, I'd implement scheduled scaling to set the auto-scaling group's minimum, maximum, and desired capacities to 0 over weekends. then restore them at the start of each week.
You're designing a two-tier architecture with web servers accessible publicly on port 443 and an RDS database accessible only to these web servers on port 3306. How would you configure security groups to meet these requirements?
I would create one security group for the web servers, allowing inbound traffic from anywhere on port 443. Then I'd create another security group for the RDS database, allowing inbound traffic only from the web server's security group on port 3306.
A company wants a fully managed shared storage solution on AWS that supports Lustre clients for a gaming application. What solution would you recommend?
I would recommend creating an Amazon Elastic File System, EFS, configuring it to support Lustre, and then attaching it to the origin server. The application server can then connect to this file system.
A company needs to process data from thousands of remote devices using UDP, minimize latency, and ensure rapid failover across AWS regions. What solution would you recommend?
I would suggest using AWS Global Accelerator with a network load balancer in each region. Then, I'd create an Amazon Elastic Container Service cluster using Fargate, set up an ECS service on the cluster, and configure the ECS service as the target for the network load balancer to process the data.
You're migrating an IIS web application to AWS. Currently, it uses an on-premises NAS file share. What AWS storage solution would you choose to replace this file share to ensure resilience and durability?
I would migrate the file share to Amazon RDS.
How can a company ensure that data written to Amazon EBS volumes is encrypted at rest when deploying a new application on EC2 instances?
They should create the EBS volumes as encrypted volumes and then attach these encrypted volumes to the EC2 instances.
A company wants to migrate a web application with varying usage patterns to AWS. The application uses a web server and a MySQL database. What's the most cost-effective database solution that won't require database modifications?
The best option would be MySQL-compatible Amazon Aurora Serverless, as it adjusts capacity automatically based on usage without needing database changes.
How would you ensure objects stored in Amazon S3 buckets remain private and avoid accidental public exposure?
I would enable the S3 block public access feature at the account level and use AWS organizations to create a service control policy that restricts IAM users from modifying this setting.
An e-commerce company is facing delays sending marketing and order confirmation emails due to increased traffic. How would you address this issue while reducing operational overhead?
I would configure the web instances to send emails through Amazon Simple Email Service, Amazon SES. This would streamline email delivery and minimize the need for operational management.
A company generates hundreds of CSV reports daily and wants to move them to AWS Cloud for near real-time analysis, minimizing administrative overhead. What solution would you suggest?
I would recommend using AWS Data Sync to transfer the files to Amazon S3 and creating an application that automates the process using the Data Sync API.
A company has petabytes of data stored in multiple Amazon S3 buckets with varying access patterns. They want to optimize costs without knowing the exact access patterns. What solution would you recommend for operational efficiency?
I would recommend creating an S3 lifecycle configuration rule to transition objects to S3 intelligent tiering, as it automatically optimizes costs based on changing access patterns.
A global e-commerce company's website hosted on AWS is experiencing slow page loads. What actions would you recommend to improve performance?
I would recommend setting up an Amazon Cloud front distribution to efficiently serve static content and creating a read replica for the Amazon RDS database to handle read-heavy database queries more effectively.
A company has EC2 instances in private subnets and Lambda functions that need direct access to these instances. They expect increased Lambda usage over the next year and want to save costs and minimize latency. What's the best approach?
They should purchase a compute savings plan, optimize the Lambda function's duration, memory usage, number of invocations, and data transfer, and connect the Lambda functions directly to the private subnet containing the EC2 instances.
How would you allow team members to access Amazon S3 buckets across 2 AWS accounts, ensuring compliance with the principle of least privilege?
I would add the development account as a principal in the trust policy of the IAM role in the production account, permitting controlled access to the S3 bucket.
A company discovered unencrypted EBS volumes in their AWS environment and wants all new EC2 instances in the AP Southeast 2 region to have encrypted volumes by default. What steps would you suggest?
First, I'd set the default encryption for EBS volumes in the EC2 console by defining an encryption key. Then, I'd update the IAM policies for each account to deny the creation of volumes if encryption isn't enabled.
A company wants to simplify database administration tasks, ensure high availability, automatic failover within 40 seconds, and offload read workloads cost-effectively using Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL. Which solution would you recommend?
I would recommend using an Amazon RDS multi-AZ-DB instance deployment, creating one read replica and directing the read workload to that replica.
A company wants to move its highly available SFTP service to a serverless solution with high performance and configurable security while managing user permissions. How would you approach this?
I would create an Amazon S3 bucket with default encryption enabled and set up an AWS Transfer Family SFTP service with a public endpoint restricted to trusted IP addresses. Then, I'd attach this bucket to the SFTP endpoint and grant users appropriate access.
A company is developing machine learning models as independent microservices on AWS. These models load around 1 gigabyte of data from Amazon S3 at startup, and usage patterns vary widely. Some models are idle for days, while others handle thousands of requests at once. How would you design a solution to handle this?
I would recommend directing user requests into an Amazon SQS queue, then deploying the models as Amazon ECS services that process the queue. I'd enable AWS autoscaling on ECS for both the cluster and service instances based on the size of the queue.
If you have an identity-based policy with specific permissions in AWS, to which IAM principles can you attach this policy?
You can attach this policy to an IAM role or an IAM group.
A company runs an application with front-end nodes needing continuous uptime and back-end nodes varying based on workload. What's the most cost-effective AWS solution?
The best solution is to use reserved instances for the front-end nodes since they require constant uptime, and spot instances for the back-end nodes because their usage varies throughout the day.
A company needs to migrate workloads with high storage capacity and up to 15,000 IOPS to Amazon EC2, aiming for cost-effective disk performance independent of storage size. Which Amazon EBS volume type would you recommend?
I would recommend using the GP3 volume type, as it allows provisioning performance independently from storage capacity and is cost-effective.
A company has a healthcare application with frequently changing data and new regulations requiring detailed audit access. They're running out of storage on premises and want to migrate to AWS securely. What's your recommended approach?
I'd recommend using AWS Snowcone to transfer the existing data securely to Amazon S3, and then using AWS CloudTrail to log management events for auditing purposes.
How would you deploy a complex Java application with a MySQL database on Apache Tomcat to ensure high availability on AWS?
I would deploy the application using AWS Elastic Beanstalk, configuring a load-balanced environment and setting up a rolling deployment policy.
In a serverless architecture with Amazon API Gateway, AWS Lambda, and DynamoDB, what's the most secure way to grant the Lambda function access to read and write data in DynamoDB?
The most secure approach is to create an IAM role that specifies Lambda as a trusted service. Attach a policy to this role that grants read and write access to the DynamoDB table, and then configure the Lambda function to use this role as its execution role.
Can you explain the effective IAM permissions for group members based on this policy?
Group members can perform any Amazon EC2 action within the US East 1 region. However, to stop or terminate instances in that region, they must be logged in using multi-factor authentication.
A company uploads CSV files from machine sensors to an S3 bucket, and these need to be converted into images quickly for graphical reports. The images are only relevant for 1 month, while the CSV files must be retained for machine learning training twice a year. What's the most cost-effective approach to handle this?
I'd set up an AWS Lambda function that automatically converts each uploaded CSV file into an image and stores it back in the S3 bucket. Additionally, I'd configure lifecycle rules in S3 to move the CSV files to Glacier storage 1 day after upload and to automatically delete the image files after 30 days.
A company has developed a web-based video game with many concurrent players. They want to show a near real-time top 10 scoreboard and also need the ability to pause and restore the game while keeping current scores. How would you design this?
I would set up an Amazon Elasticache for Redis cluster to compute and cache the scores, enabling quick updates to the scoreboard and preserving scores during game pauses and restores.
And a commerce company wants to build machine learning models for customer data analysis and integrate them with business intelligence dashboards. What's the best AWS solution with minimal operational overhead?
I would recommend using Amazon SageMaker to build and train the models, and then use Amazon QuickSight for data visualization. This approach provides efficient integration and reduces operational overhead.
A company has workloads in multiple AWS accounts and wants to prevent changes to cost usage tags. How can this be achieved?
They can create a service control policy in AWS organizations to restrict tag modifications to authorized users only.
How would you ensure minimal downtime for an AWS-hosted application during a regional outage?
I would set up an auto-scaling group and load balancer in the disaster recovery region and configure the DynamoDB table as a global table. Then I'd use DNS failover to redirect traffic to the new region's load balancer.
A company needs to migrate a 20 terabyte MySQL database to AWS within 2 weeks, aiming for minimal downtime and cost efficiency. Which solution would you recommend?
I would recommend ordering a 1 gigabit dedicated AWS Direct Connect connection to link the data center directly to AWS. Then use AWS Database Migration Service along with AWS Schema Conversion Tool to migrate the database and replicate ongoing changes.
A company has moved its PostgreSQL database to Amazon RDS, and now they face increased workloads due to a successful product launch. How can they accommodate this increased workload cost-effectively without adding infrastructure?
They should purchase reserved DB instances for the total workload and then scale up the existing Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL instance to a larger size.
A company's e-commerce site is facing performance issues due to high request rates from changing IP addresses, raising concerns about DDoS attacks. How would you handle this situation while minimally impacting legitimate users?
I would deploy AWS WF, associate it with the application load balancer, and configure a rate-limiting rule to block these illegitimate requests.
What's the most secure method for sharing an Amazon RDS database stored in a private subnet with an external auditor who has their own AWS account?
The most secure method is to create an encrypted snapshot of the database, share this snapshot with the auditor, and grant them access to the AWS Key Management Service encryption key.
A VPC has limited IP addresses and the number of EC2 instances is increasing. How would you solve this with minimal operational overhead?
I'd add an additional IPv4 CIDR block to the existing VPC, create new subnets from this block, and then deploy future resources in these new subnets.
A company created 2 backups of an Amazon RDS MySQL instance, one using MySQL dump and another as a final DB snapshot. They now want to create a new Aurora MySQL compatible instance from the latest backup. Which methods could they use?
They can either import the RDS snapshot directly into Aurora or use AWS Database Migration Service to import the RDS snapshot into Aurora.
A company is experiencing high costs due to increased on-demand instances for static web content. How would you redesign their application to optimize costs?
I would create an Amazon CloudFront distribution and host the static web content from an Amazon S3 bucket. This approach reduces the load on EC2 instances and optimizes costs.
A company has multiple AWS accounts, storing petabytes of data and uses AWS Lake Formation. They want to securely share specific data with their engineering team for analysis, minimizing operational overhead. How would you approach this?
I would use Lake Formation's tag-based access control to authorize and grant cross-account permissions, allowing the engineering team to securely access the required data with minimal operational overhead.
A company needs to host a scalable web application on AWS, accessible globally, allowing users to upload and download large amounts of data efficiently and cost-effectively. How would you approach this?
I would recommend using Amazon S3 with transfer acceleration to host the application. This solution helps minimize latency and enhances performance for worldwide users uploading and downloading large files.
How would you ensure maximum reliability for an application running on Amazon RDS and two EC2 instances in a single availability zone?
I would update the database instance to operate in multi-AZ mode and enable deletion protection. Additionally, I'd place the EC2 instances behind an application load balancer and run them within an EC2 auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones.
A company needs to migrate 700 terabytes of data from its on-premises WAN-AS system to the AWS Cloud within 90 days, without disrupting operations and maintaining data access. Which solution would you recommend?
I recommend creating an AWS Data Sync agent in the corporate data center, setting up a data transfer task, and initiating the transfer to an Amazon S3 bucket.
A company needs to retain PDF data stored in Amazon S3 for 7 years to meet legal requirements. What's the most efficient way to accomplish this?
The best approach is to enable S3 Object Lock with Compliance Retention Mode on the bucket. Set the retention period to 7 years and recopy all existing objects to ensure compliance.
How would you route traffic to multiple AWS regions for a stateless web application running on Lambda functions invoked by API Gateway?
I would create Amazon Route 53 health checks for each region and use an active-active failover configuration to route traffic.
A company has management and production VPCs connected via VPN and AWS Direct Connect, with a single VPC peering connection between them. How can you mitigate any single points of failure in this setup?
I would add a second set of VPNs to the management VPC from another customer gateway device to eliminate the single point of failure.
A company wants to quickly move its Oracle database to AWS due to limited resources and third-party features needing privileged access. What's the most cost-effective migration solution?
They should migrate the database to an Amazon EC2 Amazon Machine image for Oracle, and then customize the database settings to support the required third-party features.
Can you explain how you would migrate a 3-tier web application to AWS, considering best practices for security, scalability, and resiliency?
I would create a VPC across 2 availability zones, initially hosting the existing application architecture on EC2 instances in private subnets with auto-scaling groups. Then I'd refactor the application to separate the web, application, and database tiers, placing each in its own private subnet. For the database, I'd use Amazon RDS with a multi-AZ deployment in private subnets, restricting database access exclusively to the application tier's security groups.
During migration to AWS using ECS, Direct Connect, and RDS, what responsibilities would the company's operational team have?
The operational team would be responsible for creating Amazon RDS database instances, configuring the scheduled maintenance windows, setting up additional software components on ECS for monitoring, patch management, logging, and intrusion detection, and ensuring encryption of data transmitted through AWS Direct Connect.
A company has a Java-based job running hourly on an EC2 instance. Taking just 10 seconds and using 1 GB of memory, CPU utilization is generally low except during brief spikes. How would you optimize costs for this scenario?
I would migrate the job into an AWS Lambda function with 1 GB of memory and set up an Amazon Event Bridge scheduled rule to trigger it every hour.
A company needs a backup strategy for EC2 data and S3 buckets, with backups retained unaltered due to regulatory requirements. Which solution would you recommend?
I would recommend using AWS Backup to create a backup vault with a vault lock in governance mode, and then setting up the necessary backup plan.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.